Hello everyone, my name is Princess Joan, the chair of the International Law Commission, and for the module today, we will be going through draft articles. So what is a draft article? A draft article is a proposed legal paper that addresses various aspects of international law. Commissioners are tasked to do a detailed research on the topics that they've been assigned and come up with a draft article. So in a nutshell, a draft article reflects a commissioner's research work on the topics that they've been assigned. So what is the format of a draft article? The format is a cover page, a preambulatory clause, a recommendation clause, and references. The cover page of a draft article should contain the following logos and cover text. The first is that it should contain the gluns logo on the left-hand side of the paper. Then, it should contain the ILC logo on the far right-hand side of the paper. The cover text should have the name of the UN body, which is the International Law Commission, in full, then the topic for that symposium or event, then the name of the commissioner. The preambulatory clause contains the introduction, the issues, and the conclusion. When we look at the introduction contains the first paragraphs of the draft article. It should begin with an opening hook to catch attention. And so to achieve this, a commissioner should include an introduction of a brief and relevant background information of the research topic and the legal principles that they will be using. So put the research topic and the international legal authorities into context. You briefly state why it is important to research on that topic and briefly summarize what it is that you intend to discuss. The issues form the flesh, essentially, of your research work. It includes a deep analysis of legal questions that are to be determined. So it discusses the contentious matters that are subject to that research. So when you're formulating the issues, they should be formulated in the form of a question statement. So it should begin with whether or if or any other question word and end with a full stop, not a question mark. And so an example is whether the equitable treatment standard in international law is a uniform character and whether it meets the opinio juris to develop into customary international law. We see that the statement starts with whether and it ends with a full stop, not a question mark. So the issues being discussed are to be well laid out in paragraphs and should be arranged consecutively. Each issue should be discussed comprehensively in distinct paragraphs. Essentially, each issue should have its own paragraph when being discussed. As one progresses from one issue to the next, there needs to be a relation of those issues. Do not simply list them down. Instead, make sure to analyze them in a way that they tie into one another. Ensure that there is a connection of flow between one issue and the next. So when you're analyzing your issues, you use the IRAC method. The IRAC method is essentially issues, rules, analysis, and then conclusion. How the IRAC method is applicable is when you're starting with the issue, you identify every single issue and then provide a separate rule and a separate analysis for each of them before you write a general conclusion. So when issues are being formulated in the IRAC method, the issues use a question statement, meaning you start with whether or if, and then you end with a question mark and not a full stop. So it should be a full question ended with a question mark. The rule is what international statute or what international convention applies. So to determine what rule to apply, you need to engage in rule identification, which is essentially digging through some materials to find the right laws and the right case laws to use. you need to use the primary sources of international law, such as the Charter of the UN, the Statute of the ILC, and international case law, as well as United Nations resolutions. For the analysis, it's the most crucial part, and ideally, it should be the longest. It requires critical thinking to apply the rule to the specific fact and to describe how that rule is applicable to that set of facts. The commissioner has to demonstrate the knowledge of the subject matter, originality, and depth of analysis. You have to marry the law to the problem, and you have to provide a reasoned and well laid out argument through coherence, clarity, and consistency of your expression. It also needs to be realistic and practical. So ideally, in summary, when you're using the IRAC method, you first need to lay out all the issues that you have identified. Then for every separate issue, you need to identify a rule that applies to that issue. After that, provide an analysis of how that rule applies to that issue or those set of facts, and how can it be implemented, and how can we realize progressive development of that issue. Finally, we have the conclusion. The conclusion explains what is the most probable outcome of that issue. It's the summation of the thought process that you've had, that you've expressed in the draft article. So you give a brief statement. In a brief statement, you give the general conclusion. After that, you explain your ultimate conclusion. There is no need to be repetitive, but essentially provide a conclusion that sums up your entire work and that gives your ultimate position that you are making. It's important to note that it's imperative for the commissioner to give markers to indicate that the conclusion is being made. So for example, as you're beginning the paragraph of your conclusion, you need to make it easy for the person reading your work to identify that it is in fact a conclusion that you're writing. You could use in conclusion, you could use in summary, in finality, etc. Just to make sure that the person reading your work is able to notice that the paragraph that you are starting is in fact a conclusion. The third part of a draft article is a recommendation clause. In this segment, the commissioner is required to give proposals with respect to the issues that they've discussed. So the recommendations have to cure or have to solve the legal issues, and they have to be clear, concise, and relevant. They also need to be within the jurisdiction of the ILC, and they have to touch on the application of international law. The recommendations are to be structured in a manner of stating an existing situation in a particular issue, and propose how that would be rectified or how we can improve the situation. The final part is the references. For this segment, you need to make an organized listing of all the sources of information that you've used in the draft article. So the order of listing that information should be, you first begin with international legal instruments such as statutes, conventions, treaties, declarations, and then you move on to list any international case law that you have used. You then move on to list United Nations resolutions, then United Nations reports, then books, journals, newspapers, and online websites should be the last thing that you list. So when you're drafting draft articles, there are policies that are supposed to be followed. The first policy are the writing guidelines. In the writing guidelines, the International Law Commission in gluns shall accept draft articles from any member or from any commissioner in gluns. All commissioners are obligated to draft mandatory. It is mandatory for you to draft the draft articles. Only commissioners who have drafted the articles will be granted first audience in the plenary and may be eligible for any awards. Therefore, if you have not submitted a draft article, you are not eligible for any awards under gluns ILC. For identification, you need to include your name and your school. The word count of a draft article should ideally be from 1,000 words to 3,000 words. It is up to your discretion, but it needs to be within that threshold. The submissions should be done through a Word document file only, and the file naming should be your name, your school, ILC, meaning the organ, and the symposium that you're attending. They should be submitted through an email address that will be provided in the background guide. The language of the draft article is strictly in English. Any other language is not allowed. Commissioners should be aware that there is no payment for the submission of draft articles. The International Law Commission does not currently pay commissioners for their submissions of draft articles. For the guidelines on anonymity and confidentiality, is that the Codification Division shall keep confidential all the details of the commissioner while the draft articles are being edited. This is only subject to a declaration as part of an open editorial process, and the process shall be confidential and shall be conducted in anonymity. The details about all submitted draft articles shall be kept confidential, and no comments shall be issued to outside parties about the draft articles under consideration or whether they are rejected or not. On the policy of the publication process, the draft articles will be first reviewed by the chair of the International Law Commission for completeness, clarity, and overall quality of writing. The articles that are submitted for publication shall be judged by the importance, originality, value of content, quality of writing, and relevance to the topic at hand. The chair shall provide content procurement and direction for the editing. They shall formulate policies and guidelines on ethical publishing processes, and they shall make the final decision on the acceptance or rejection of submitted draft articles. Accepted draft articles will be assigned to the Codification Division for review and publication. The Codification Division shall revise and review all submitted draft articles to ensure that there is a correct tone, clarity, flow, and structure of content. They will also ensure that there is correct spelling, punctuation, and that no grammatical errors exist. They will verify the factual correctness of content, information, and statistics, and they will edit the structure and organization of draft articles to ensure that it is consistent. On policies of warranty and representation, by submission of a draft article to the International Law Commission, the Commissioner warrants and respects that they have included no material that is in violation or infringement of any right of any other person. The draft article should not infringe any existing copyright or license. It should be original, and no part has to be generated by artificial intelligence or has previously been published in any form or contains any form of plagiarism. It should contain nothing defamatory or unlawful, and it should not contain any information as to pornographic materials. The Commissioner should ensure that they have complied with all the laws pertaining data protection and privacy, and that at the time of submission, the draft article is not in consideration anywhere else. Thank you.